Good morning to all of you, and apologies for my recent absence. I snuck in a little summer holiday, and on the way to the airport last week in Italy, the taxi driver was most alarmed when he heard that I was travelling back to the UK. Is it safe, he asked. What's going on over there, he wanted to know. Some people are talking about civil war. Now, I'm not sure whether he read Elon Musk's social media comments, but the impression this country gave for a few horrible days last week was that the worst demons of football hooliganism had been unleashed in a racist orgy of unrest. 6 countries, at least 6, actually gave out travel advisories to their people not to go to the UK this summer on a holiday. What the rest of the world didn't notice was the assertion of neighbourly normality, the communities coming together around burnt-out libraries or damaged hotels housing asylum seekers. So Keir Starmer promised to be tough and lived up to his word. More than 600 arrests so far, over 100 people sentenced, the vast majority of them men. The average length of a sentence, about 2 years. This morning, what is behind these riots? Is it social inequality, or is it the thrill of violence, or perhaps a bit of both? Is it the voice of the unheard? And if we address the underlying causes, are we rewarding the violence that we've seen? Call me, 0345 6060 973. Lots to unpack here. It's been a really troubling week. Raising some really serious issues, and let's try and get to the bottom of some of the stuff if we can. 2 guests this morning: Dr. Mike Hope, operational lead for the Enable project, which uses evidence-based approach to research football policing and worked for 23 years in the operational service of policing, and Aurelien Mondon, researching racism, populism and the far right, and the author of Reactionary Democracy. Welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Dr. Mike Hope. I mean, it may seem like a daft question, but it is the question. What's behind the riots? Is it about social inequality, or is it about the thrill of violence, having a sort of community of violence, getting together and just, kicking stuff down and beating people up? Mike?
I think probably, good morning, probably a mixture of all the above, really. I think there's elements of far-right politics and racism that's coming into this. I think there are other people who see this as an opportunity to come out, sometimes for their own ends, strategically to confront the police, anti-authority, or rob stores and loot, knowing that police resources are stretched. I think there's a complex set of scenarios going on there, but I think it obviously all stemmed from the horrific events in Southport, and the sort of narrative that came off of the back of that was the anti-immigration, asylum seeker. So there's clearly an element of that at work within this process.
And Aurelien Mondon, the extraordinary thing about these riots, rather like the Gilets jaunes in France, is that they are leaderless. They're not orchestrated by one individual or a group of individuals. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Or that seems to be right, at least. And this is something that's been quite surprising, and that many people didn't quite expect in a way, because we're used to having these kind of riots or these kind of movements being led by people. And of course, these influencers, are around there, but they don't seem to be leading themselves. So that's been, I think, quite interesting, and I think that has made it a lot harder to tackle, really. But, again, I think we need to be careful about this kind of leaderless movement, because while there may not be single leaders leading this, I think, the ideas that are behind this kind of emboldening of extreme right politics, really, I think have leaders and have, spokespeople, really. So I think it's not entirely leaderless, if you want. I think there has been a leading to this, in a way.
Right, and explain that path towards these riots, because a lot of people have been pointing to some of the newspapers, pointing to comments made by politicians, pointing to headlines like, the judges are the enemies of the people. Mm-hmm. How important is that context, Aurelien?
It's crucial, and I think one of the mistakes that was made, I think, as we saw these kind of events unfold, was to think that they were coming out of nowhere because of the violence, and of course this was really, really shocking violence, but at the same time it was not entirely unexpected, and it was not surprising. These things have been bubbling under the surface for quite a long time now. We've had these racist extremist demonstrators, and we're chanting slogans that we've seen in our mainstream politics, that we've seen in our mainstream media. All of these has emboldened them to act. When you hear members of parliament, when you hear ministers, when you hear the mainstream media saying these kind of things, then you just, and you see nothing happening, and you have this kind of tendency towards racism and extreme right politics, then you take action yourself, right? So I think we need to be very careful about thinking of these as exceptional forms of politics. They very much find their roots in mainstream discourse at the moment, and we need much more responsibility.
And Mike, do you think that comments made by some of our the senior politicians, including some former prime ministers, and by some members of parliament like Nigel Farage, asking questions? Who was behind this? The stabbing of the 3 girls. Could it have been an asylum seeker? Could it not? When actually the evidence was pointing in a different direction. Do you think that without those comments, those riots would have happened anyway? Or do you think that they're responsible for making them worse?
I think it's difficult to say whether they would have happened without them, but I think they certainly contribute. If you ask questions and people have a particular view, that then it fuels into their views. I think one of the difficulties is that I think there's a distrust now of politicians and government events over the last few years, and I think people are seeking alternative explanations from people online who have significant influence. So I think when you put the whole picture together and you get these comments and these questions raised, it as we've seen, it feeds into this narrative, and when people hold these views, it just fuels what they almost want to believe.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are worried about immigration. There are a lot of people who are worried about social inequality. These are all, perfectly legitimate issues, to tackle. And yet, the numbers of people who are rioting on the streets and kicking down doors and trying to burn down libraries of hotels housing asylum seekers is a tiny minority. I mean, they're doing that bigger group of people a disservice, aren't they, Mike?
Yes, there's people who want to have legitimate conversations within this, but obviously, like anything, those who shout the loudest make the most noise and seek the most attention. And clearly those at the more extreme end of this debate have been the ones out on the street. And then again, the factors, they identify with a set of beliefs, they come out onto the streets, they see other people in other towns doing the same thing, people become emboldened and empowered that there's an opportunity to take on the police. And again, you get these other motivations that come into it as well. So it's a complex picture, but yes, clearly at the heart of it are some extreme views.
Aurelien, so what's the right mixture? What's the secret sauce, of trying to get something positive out of this very negative experience? Some people are saying that if you now have a very earnest conversation about social inequality and immigration, again, we've had plenty of those in the past, you're rewarding the violence. And other people say, unless you have that conversation, the violence will never go away. Which one is right?
Well, I'm not sure either of them is right, to be honest. I think what we need to do is change the way we shape our public discourse at the moment. I think we have made our public arena a very toxic environment, and I think this is very much a top-down process. I've done some research on this with my colleagues in a report recently published by the Renimid Trust, where we look at the way the immigration issue is being constructed. And when people are asked, for example, what are the biggest issues facing your country at the moment, immigration will be quite high. But when the same people are asked, according to you, what are the biggest issues facing you personally at the moment, no one seems to care about immigration. People care about social inequality, about health, all of these kind of things. So we just need to shift this discourse away.
So why is immigration such a compelling issue? I mean, I've just come back from the United States. It is a huge issue. And you talk to people, in Wisconsin where, in small communities where I've just been, where there are very few immigrants from south of the border, and they say immigration is the most serious issue. And you say, well, I can't see anyone from El Salvador or Honduras in your town. So why is it such a big issue? Why?
Well, why? Because it is a mediated issue, if you want. When you want to make sense of the world around you, just like you and I, people in Wisconsin have to trust other people. We can't know everything about our countries ourselves, right? Even I, as a political scientist, don't know how everything works in my country, about the economy, about politics, and so on and so forth. So you need to trust some sources, and these sources could be, religious institutions, they could be your family, they could be your friends, your workplace, but more often than not, they are the media, they are politicians. And, if the media and politicians tell you day in, day out that one of the biggest kind of crises that we are facing is immigration, is asylum seekers, is people coming by boat, as opposed to actually public services being run down, as opposed to, social inequality and all of that, this is what you're going to focus on, right? So we need people to help us make sense of the world. And these people have a huge amount of power. And it's people like you in the media, it's people like me in academia, it's people like the people in parliament, in councils and so on, the people who have a privileged access to shaping public discourse. And we have a responsibility here to make this public discourse more positive, to make this public discourse more inclusive. And if what we focus on is divisive, is immigration, it's moral panics, then we create a fertile ground for what we saw happening, over the last couple of weeks. And I think, where the hope is actually still seeing the resistance to this extreme right politics, still seeing people on the ground, helping clean up, helping protect.
Which I mentioned at the top of the show as well. But as you know, Aurelien and Mike, that there's votes in negativity, there's votes in stirring things up, and this has been Trump's kind of secret source of power from the very beginning when he first announced his candidacy in 2015. There were some very bad hombres on the other side of the border. This is what his base likes to hear. So, Mike, what hope is there for the kind of positive change in language that Aurelien has been advocating?
Well, again, as Aurelien talks about, I think it's important that politicians start to recognise the challenges around this. And again, I think it's easy, if you look at austerity and everything else, the pandemic, all the issues with government, public services being run down, policing, NHS, all those things, it's easy for someone else to be blamed. And it seeks that the Conservative government, stop the boats, all this kind of stuff. It's almost seen that the influx of immigrants is what's causing the pressure on the country. Well, actually, when you unpack it, it's a lot more to do with the course of politics that we've had over the last few years. So I think it's changed narrative, really, and understanding what the root causes are and then starting to address them.
But there's another thing, isn't there, here, Mike? I mean, you see these people, they spend a lot of time online, as many of us do. You have your opinions confirmed in a kind of very circular way in the echo chamber of social media. And then when you then meet up in a social gathering that might become a riot, that community element of getting together, combined with some violence, this may sound weird, but that's kind of compelling for a lot of people, isn't it?
Yes, and I think I think that when you look at it, that's why football hooliganism, using the sort of the sort of media terminology for it, that's why it's appealing for some people, and that's why I think there is a link to right-wing politics. There has historically always been that link between football hooliganism and the xenophobic nature, particularly when you think back to the 70s, the 80s and the 90s of England fans abroad, the behaviour. It feeds quite nicely into, so those organising the extreme right-wing, it feeds quite nicely into their agenda to utilise and mobilise groups of risk hooligan football fans who can turn up at these events.
Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, a.k.a. Tommy Robinson, came from a Luton Football Fan Association. That's how he started, isn't that right, Mike?
Yes, yeah. And I think, one of the things is, I think, he certainly has a lot of followers and people who buy into his ideology. And I think one of the things is he looks like them, he talks like them, he dresses in the casual sort of football lad way, so that people relate to him. And it's that kind of that level, obviously the EDL that came about in Luton, which he was an integral part of organising to start with, that all comes from that football lad culture.
Right. Just finally then, how dangerous could today be, a Saturday when, football matches are taking place across the country, people are gathering in the stands? Are you worried about today, Mike?
So I think it's important to put some context. The vast majority of people going to watch football today will want nothing to do with any of the sort of scenes that we've seen on the streets. However, as I've said, there is an established link between football disorder and right-wing politics. And one of the things police will be monitoring. So all the games today will have been previously risk assessed to understand the risk they posed and resources allocated. That would have been done several weeks ago. Obviously, events of the last week or 10 days have meant they will have had to been reassessed based on do the groups affiliated to those particular teams, have they featured in the events of the last 10 days? I know from speaking to officers around the country, there have been evidence of hooligans in attendance at these groups and events, and therefore they will reassess them. But it tends to be more limited to smaller groups. That the good thing is the police have specialist officers who understand these groups, know their identities, can engage and get into dialogue with them. So they will be confident that if these groups come out today, they will have more of an idea of what they're dealing with than the anonymity of people just randomly coming to the events of the last 10 days. And
finally and briefly, Aurelien, to you, I mean, the crackdown on hooliganism by the police back in, I guess it was in the 90s, seemed to have worked to a large extent. I mean, it's no longer the problem that it was. Does the crackdown against the rioters work as a disincentive to keeping people off the streets and preventing that kind of violence? Or does it just make the underlying causes, the so-called unheard voices, even more prevalent and in the end, even more serious?
Yeah, I think there's a real risk of making them martyrs in many ways, right? So I think we need to be very careful. Law and order is just not enough. I think we need far more than this. So yeah, we need a more positive narrative, as I said.
Okay. Aurelien Mondon and Dr. Mike Hope, thank you very much to both of you. The question to you is, to what extent should we be looking at the underlying social causes, as has just been suggested, after this summer storm of riots, or is that rewarding the violence? Can you both crack down on the rioters and deal with, immigration, social inequality and all that stuff that makes many, many people come out on the streets?